Tonight, the world's foremost expert on Hollywood's classic scary movies. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and these are our incredible stories.
Well, we'd like to welcome all of our friends and family across the United States and in more than 50 countries around the world, including Nora and Harold in Austria, and Alex and Lucy and their lovable creatures in England, and Roberto and Stephanie in Munich, Germany. Gary and I are always honored when you folks take a few minutes out of your very busy schedules to sit back, relax, and enjoy some incredible stories with us. Tonight, we have with us an incredible human encyclopedia of all things related to Hollywood's classic scary movies. So we're going to welcome Greg Mank.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be with you, Richard and Gary, and thank you.
And Greg, we're going to let Gary start off because he has some questions about your latest books.
Absolutely.
Very good.
We read one of your books. Kind of got us fired up about the whole thing.
The very bewitching.
The very bewitching time of night, which is a great little companion piece after watching The Cat People. So, I mean, tell us a little bit more of some of your writings, because you do a lot of factual stuff about films, but you also happen to have some very interesting fiction books as well.
Yes, well, gee, it's crazy how long ago this addiction goes. I mean, it goes all the way back to when I was 6 years old, when it first set in. And that was, I'm originally from Baltimore. And when I was 6 years old, Shock Theater came on there. And of course, they were the old Universal horror films. And Frankenstein was the premiere. And I got hooked then and kind of stayed hooked for life. And so some years ago, when I say some years, I'm talking about 40 years ago, I wrote a book about the Frankenstein films called It's Alive. I then later wrote another book about Karloff and Lugosi, which was appropriately titled Karloff and Lugosi. But yes, the most recent books that have come out, there are two. One is a nonfiction book, Angels and Ministers of Grace Defend Us. Line, of course, comes from Shakespeare and from Hamlet. And that book is a behind-the-scenes account of a number of classic horror films with some new twists, with some new discoveries, some new facts about the backgrounds, problems they had with the censors, how they did at the box office, what happened with the making of the movies. Sometimes horror movies are unintentionally horror movies because of the way that they're made. They run into so many troubles and so many problems and so many predicaments trying to be produced and to come a warning into the world that they actually become horror films on various levels. And this covers some of those films, such as Island of Lost Souls and Bride of Frankenstein, Werewolf of London, and so on. That's Angels and Ministers of Grace Defend Us from McFarlane Publishers. And the second book is actually my first stab at fiction, and that is a book called Frankenstein's Witch, St. Lizzie Pray for Us. And that novel, actually, a large part of it deals with the production of Frankenstein back in 1931, and all the incredibly rich, dramatic, fascinating people who were involved in that film. Boris Karloff, Colin Clodd, the director James Whale, so on and so forth. And in this fictional account, they run afoul of a witch, or a woman who proclaims to be a witch. And she becomes somewhat intimately involved with the production and causes all variety of terrible trouble. Then the book also has a section in 1967, which of course was the Summer of Love, and this witch seems to appear again resurrected and back in Southern California, causing all kinds of trouble. So it's a very intense book. One of the reviews that came out recently about it said, I'll read this here. It said, "This is a dark, complex tale dealing with guilt, sin, redemption, religious mania, and sexual obsession." So there you are. I tried to cover all the bases in the book, and it was great fun to write, and it was fun to fictionalize those characters who I've written about in a nonfiction way for so many years and in so many books, and to kind of mix them up with this entirely fictitious creation of this witch in the story. And she is definitely a bad witch. You know, they're talking to Wizard of Oz, you're a good witch or a bad witch. Well, this gal was definitely a bad witch. So it was a lot of fun to do, and I certainly had enjoyed writing it, and it was great fun.
When you first started out, did you intend to really load it up with some background material that was actual, factual from Hollywood movies?
Yes, I figured that, the best way to start, to kind of give myself a head start, was to try to, they always say, write about what you know when you're writing a novel. And I figured, I certainly know a lot about this, dates and places and names and backgrounds and so on and so forth. And so, it was very interesting to use, what I had learned over the years about these people to kind of get myself started. And then once that happened, then the fictional characters mixed in. Including the hero of the book, whose name is Porter Downey, the detective. And they all mixed in with it, really surprisingly smoothly. I really had a ball. I kind of hated to turn it in to have it published because it was becoming an addiction. I thought, oh boy, I get to write more of my book today, kind of thing. So you kind of fall in love with your own characters, when you do this sort of thing. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And as you know from your work and from the people you've talked with and so on, and it gets to the point that you think, I can't end this. I've ended. I can't go back and keep having fun with it. So, but as it turns out, there are a couple more books in that series that are taking form now. So I'm comforting myself with that as it goes along. But it was fun to bring these characters into the world, and great experience for me at this point in my life for all these years of writing nonfiction.
Now, for those listeners who might be interested in this book, where are some places that they might be able to pick up a copy for themselves?
They can always go to Amazon. Amazon Books is on Amazon Books, and they can also go to my website, which I'll give you right now, and that is www.gregorymank.com. That's again www.gregorymank.com. And Frankenstein's Witch is also available through Barnes and Noble, and it's out there lurking, so you can track it down. Yeah.
Now, aside from the books, one of the things that really brought you to our attention was the work that you do with your commentary for DVDs. So my question is, how does one get into being a DVD commentator?
Oh, gee, you have to be asked, really. I know a lot of people ask that question and say, where do I sign up to do this? And it's a case really of somebody coming along and saying, I sort of like what you gentlemen are doing. They say, I read something that you wrote about this film, and would you like to develop that into an audio commentary? So I've done about 12 or 14, I believe, audio commentaries, and they all were on films that I had, written about extensively and had done a lot of research on, and was able to, jump in with what I already knew. And they're challenging to do because of the fact that, of course, different people do them in different ways. But one way I always try to do them is try to make them at least partially scene specific, so that what you're talking about on the commentary is what the person's seeing on the screen at the time that, you're talking about that particular little nugget of information. So it involves an awful lot of timing and cutting and pruning and everything to try to get it to work out that way. But they are fun. And the problem, again, you feel, after you do one, you feel like you've actually been in the movie. That sounds strange, but you feel like somehow you've bled into the film, by the time you finish doing an audio commentary with it, because you become so involved with it and watched it so many times and know all the dialogue, and you feel like, gee, I was on the set for this film. I worked on that movie. Whereas, of course, that's not at all the case. But no, you get very, very intimately involved with the movie when you do an audio commentary. And the only problem with it is that after you have finished with it, it's like you never want to see the movie again.
Oh, no.
It's like, every once in a while I'll be, changing a channel in Film and Television that I've done an audio commentary for the DVD, and I think, oh, quick, change the channel. Can't go back there again.
Gotta have a little time.
But it's. I mean, you still love the film, but it's just that you've given it your best shot and try to cover it from every angle, and it's like. Okay, I've been there and done that. This is a closed chapter. Let's move on. But no, they are fun to do, and of course it's people have been able to pass on a lot of information this way that somebody wouldn't necessarily pick up who wasn't necessarily a big book buyer or book reader. With the films, they actually see the film and hear the history at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that really comes through, especially when we were listening to the commentary for Cat People, is your passion for the film. And to me, and even talking with you right now, you are a person, it seems to me, who is very passionate about the subject material. And I myself am a very big fan of classic horror and film in general. And it's always more entertaining and more insightful, I think, when you have somebody who really appreciates the material. Where do you think your passion comes from?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways you come to understand what the people in the film are trying to do, and how deeply they're putting themselves into the work. I mean, now in the case of Cat People, of course, we just start with the producer, Val Lewton. And for any of your listeners who may not know, Val Lewton was a young man who joined RKO Studios in 1942, and his job was to make horror films. Now, he wasn't a particular big horror fan, but that was the position they gave him. They said, we want you to make horror films. There's only really two requirements that you follow. You have to make it for under $150,000 per film, all right, which even in those days was very, very low. And you have to make it based on a title test that we do. Now, in the case of Cat People, for example, they passed out flyers in a theater and said, which of these movies would you go to see if you saw the title? And on the list was Cat People. So enough people checked off Cat People that Lewton was, stuck, if you will, certainly the way he looked at it, stuck with making a movie called Cat People. And it's interesting because he was a great intellectual. He was a historian. He was a poet. He was a very, very intelligent man and a very sophisticated man. And he was just, as the writer DeWitt Bodine, who wrote the screenplay, said, when Val Lewton learned that he was going to make a movie named Cat People, he just was completely, blown away. I mean, he was just so upset. I mean, he thought, here I am, Val Lewton, great wise man of Hollywood, and here I am, they're make a movie called Cat People, and he actually called in Bodine and said, look, if you want to quit, I don't blame you. If you don't have to write this movie if you don't want to, because right. it sounds like it's going to be a horrible movie. Well, and of course, what he did was so clever and so subversive, is that he took this movie, which on the surface is about a young woman who fears that she might turn into a leopard or a panther. All right. And actually what it is that it is below the surface. It's the story of a bride who is fearful that if she consummates her marriage to her husband, that, she will somehow destroy him. She's frightful of consummating her marriage. You can interpret on various different levels to what her actual personal problems are, but actually it's about a bride who's fearful of consummating her marriage. And in those days, the censors would have never allowed a movie like that to be made. But by him masquerading it as a horror film, it got made. And, audiences, without necessarily focusing directly on what he was kind of doing behind the scenes, they nevertheless felt it. They felt something really bizarre going on in this movie when they saw it. So I think in the case of Cat People, I really admire Lewton because he was for one thing, he didn't give up. I mean, he was stuck with something he didn't want to do, and he didn't give up. He decided he would make the absolute best of it. He wouldn't just walk through it. He wouldn't put together a very shoddy movie called Cat People with the usual horror stuff. He wanted to make it as cleverly and movingly and tragically as he possibly could, and he did. And he made this really, really brilliant film about sex problems, basically, and. Of course, the film came out and it was an enormous success. And then he was kind of stuck making another 8 of these particular kinds of movies, all of which were title tested, all of which were supposed to be under $150,000 and so on and so forth. So, you become sort of passionately involved in the people. I mean, you think about, what Val Lewton had to go through. You think about actors like Karloff and Lugosi, who, when they received mail from people, people would say, "I think you're absolutely horrifying," or, you know, "I have nightmares about you," or "You terrify me," or, you know, in the case of Karloff, he'll play Arsenic and Old Lace and says, "You know, I killed that man because he said I looked like Boris Karloff," you know, this sort of thing. And that, you know, their fame was that they were frightening men,
right.
That they were able to frighten people. And, you know, how did this sit with them? How did they make peace with this? I mean, how did it go down? And so all that was always very, very instrumental with me. I was always very fascinated in that aspect of the horror films, maybe more so than I was in the actual horror characters themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the actors and the directors and the producers and how they felt about this very, very strange work that Hollywood was forcing them to do.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the tragedies about horror movies is that there's such a wonderful level of sophistication to the storytelling, especially to some of these old classics, that gets overlooked because people just assume because it's a horror movie, it's just something that was thrown together just to make a few bucks. But there really are levels to these stories that go much deeper if people are willing to look. What would you say?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it's that's exactly the way. And I kind of tried to emulate that, in fact, in the novel I wrote, because, you know, we had to have a title like Frankenstein's Witch because of the fact that we felt it was the only way to attract the readership to it that would necessarily be interested in some of the background of the novel. But at the same time, I tried to be very keen on putting in the various things I, you know, noted a little while ago about it, about all the different human elements and the you know, the passion, the tragedy, and the obsessions, and so on and so forth. And so that if somebody does, you know, read it, that they see there's more of this than just a crazy title, you know, and there's more of this than just this kind of thing where somebody, you know, is going to pick it up. I mean, I remember one time Elena Verdugo, who played in House of Frankenstein, which was called a monster rally, had the monster and the Wolfman and Dracula in it and everything, and she played a gypsy girl. And I said, you know, were you excited when you got this part? And she said, no. She said, the horror movies in those days, they were the kind of things that when they came on the screen, everybody in the audience went, woo, you know, very derisively and everything, because, you know, they didn't differentiate. You know, they just figured a horror movie is a horror movie. No, watch, look at me, aren't I scared, kind of thing. But no, it really required in those people working in Hollywood at the time, that the great horror films such as Cat People and Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein and The Black Cat and so many others, you know, it really required somebody who really had a passion for what they were doing, an enormous amount of creativity, and a lot of guts, you know, to keep working and to be encouraged to make this the best piece of entertainment that they could possibly make. And you know, it's kind of a lesson for everybody in life, really. That that if you're when you're stuck with something that's not ideal, just do your very best and hope for the best, and you know, go from there. So yeah, it's easy to get involved in the kind of, you know, heroic spirit of these men, which is what they were. They were kind of heroes, you know, making these films and making them as well as they could.
Right. Who would you say are the pioneers of horror when it comes to directors and writers? Who are your top guys?
Well, my favorite is James Whale, of course, who directed Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. And Whale, for example, was exceptionally good at creating lost souls, as I would put it. And if you watch the original Frankenstein, for example, you have sympathy both for the monster maker, who's played by Colin Clive, and you have sympathy for the monster, who's played by Boris Karloff. You know, you don't hiss or boo either one of them. You know, you understand both of them. You understand what Frankenstein is trying to do in creating the monster, and you understand what the monster is trying to do in finding some kind of identity once he comes into the world. That, you know, these people are these characters are misfits, perhaps, or very, very strange characters, and literally a monster. But you know, they nevertheless, they either have a soul or they're trying to find a soul, and so therefore you sympathize with them, and they kind of have the same problems that we all have. You figure as you watch the film, and so Whale was very, very good at that. That he was able to kind of bring this lost soul quality into the films. As far as some of the other great directors of the time, you know, a lot of Jacques Turner, who directed Cat People, was a marvelous director. Robert Wise, who of course was a very, very successful director, won 2 Oscars for, you know, Sound of Music and West Side Story, and you know, but started off working for Luton and directed part of Curse of the Cat People and The Body Snatcher and films like that. You know, all these men were at the top of their game, and you know, they brought enormous talent and vitality and insight to the films. So all those directors, all the directors who did that, who were able to bring that, to make it happen. Todd Browning, of course, has taken a lot of flack, who directed Dracula in recent years, but he was marvelous at atmospherics. All right, he wasn't very good necessarily at kind of penetrating the psyche of the characters that he presented, but he could, you know, he could dress up a horror film like nobody else could, as far as putting in the spiders and the castles and, you know, armadillos and all kinds of crazy stuff that he put in the films. So they were great. Edgar G. Ulmer, who directed The Black Cat, was a brilliant man, and you know, it was remarkable what he was able to get into that film, as far as the amount of depravity, really, that he managed to get into a 65-minute movie, you know, with necrophilia and incest and devil worship and all that sort of thing. And he not only managed to get it in there, but he managed to get it in quite tastefully and, you know, really very, very resplendently and smoothly. So all these directors who kind of show a little bit of themselves, I think, when they direct, not in a showy way, and in the sense that they're showing off what they can do, but just that it's just kind of a natural part of their work that it manifests itself within the movie.
Oh, absolutely.
And you know, that level of creativity is amazing when you think about back then in the day, they had to bring these productions in on time and within budget.
Oh, mercilessly. Yeah, absolutely mercilessly. I mean, if any of these directors ever went, you know, even they didn't have to go too elaborately over budget or over schedule, and they'd never work again, you know, kind of thing. I mean, it was an absolute necessity, as you say. Very good point. That you know, they didn't have all day to sit down and figure out how this was going to work out, or you know, they had to kind of, you know, fly by the seat of their pants and hope they got it right in the little bit of time they had to go, and with a little bit of money they were given to make it happen.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, it's funny, we were just talking about Todd Browning and Dracula. A few years ago, I picked up one of the anniversary editions of the DVD, and I didn't realize it, but there's actually 2 versions of Dracula. One of them, which was done in Spanish, that was filmed at the same time as Todd Browning's, and I believe they said they used all of the sets and everything in the evenings, and they would film the entire thing. Talk about a money saver.
Oh yeah, it's very, very shrewd on Universal's part to have done that. It was very, very, very clever, and you know, and they imported Spanish actors for the for the leading roles, and it worked out very, very favorably for the studio. Yeah,
absolutely.
Good point.
Well, I tell you what, Greg. I'm looking at the very witching time of night now, right before me, dark alleys of classic horror cinema, and this has quickly become one of my favorite reads.
Thank you.
And not simply because of the Cat People, but there's just a lot of other movies in there that are just unbelievable. Is there some part of this book, some films in here that perhaps you enjoyed writing about or bringing information to us more than others?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question. One of the chapters I really enjoyed doing was there's a chapter in there called John Carradine and His Traveling Circus. And this sort of hits onto what we're talking about with horror films. And that was that, you know, the great character actor John Carradine, you know, appeared in a lot of horror films, and eventually was kind of known, you know, more than anything else for his horror films, which was ironic. But during the World War II years, he decided, again, talking about a man with a dream, he decided he wanted to create his own Shakespearean stage company, because that was what he really loved. He was just passionate about Shakespeare. And so he wanted to create his own Shakespeare company, and he wanted to tour in it, and he wanted to open on Broadway in it. And so he had to finance it himself. He had to find all the money himself. And one of the ways that he got the money to put on his Shakespeare company, which he called John Carradine and his Shakespeare Players, was that he made horror films. And he made films such as even at Monogram, which made the sort of Poverty Row horror films. And he made a picture there called Voodoo Man with Bela Lugosi, and he made a picture there called Return of the Ape Man with Bela Lugosi. And he was literally making these films by day and rehearsing and performing his company at night. In one case, in the case of Voodoo Man, he actually started shooting Voodoo Man on a Monday and opened his company in San Francisco the following Sunday. Right? I mean, it was that frantic what he was doing.
Oh wow!
So it was absolutely incredible. And so what happened was there was a whole different definition, if you will, of horror films, which in the Carradine's case was, I did them for the money to create my Shakespeare company. And so people would come to him all the time in later years and say, what can you tell us about making Voodoo Man? Or what can you tell us about making Return of the Ape Man? Or what can you tell us about making Captive Wild Woman, in which, he turned a starlet, into an ape woman, and these sort of films. And Carradine really didn't remember them at all. Or if he did, he didn't admit it.
Really?
His explanation was, he said, I did a lot of films back in those days, and every cent I made, I paid to the actors in my company. I paid to the costumers. I paid to the railroads, to get us from one engagement to another. He never did get to Broadway with the company. He wanted to open there on Shakespeare's birthday in 1944, but he never. That didn't happen. But in that case, horror films for him. He absolutely did his best. There's no doubt about it. He never walked through anything, and he didn't walk through any of the horror films. But he was making those movies purely for the money they paid him in order to translate translate that into an investment for his stage company. And so when we talk about people who brought a lot of love and passion and creativity to the genre, like Val Lewton, as to what they did, Carradine's sort of a different case. He was using them for money, but the bottom line is he still acted in them as if he thought they were all Academy Award worthy movies. Mm. He plays a mentally enfeebled character in Voodoo Man, and he's in a way he's brilliant. He doesn't just shuffle through it or go through it in such a way that that he doesn't seem to be caring about what he's doing. He really throws himself into the role. And he figures he's doing this, then he leaves, and then he drives out to Pasadena at the Pasadena Playhouse, and that night he goes on and plays Othello or Iago or because he alternated in both roles, or Hamlet or Shylock or something of this nature. And nevertheless, that would have been what he really loved, but he never stinted on what he was doing. Meanwhile, in the studios. So that was kind of an unusual chapter to do. It was a different path for horror films, and a different kind of approach,
and something that most people aren't aware of or never heard of.
I wasn't aware of that at all. But that's really fascinating.
So
and another one. Thank you. And another one that was very sad was the case of Helen Chandler, who it was the leading lady in Dracula, and there's a long interview in there with her sister-in-law, who was her best friend, and they talk about what a tragic life Helen Chandler had, and that her life was real horror. All right, she had an alcohol problem. She had all kinds of terrible mishaps. She was burned in a fire that scarred one side of her face. Her career ended long before she died. And so there was a woman who, both starred in a classic horror film, but also whose life was much more horrible and horrific than the classic horror film Dracula in which she appeared. Mm. So I felt very, very sorry for her. She's sort of a favorite of mine, and I feel, great sympathy for what she had to go through. And it was meaningful to me to try to pay tribute to her in the book, on learning what kind of a tragic life she had to lead.
And anytime we talk about someone like that in our books, they're really immortalized forever.
They are, and she is, and she was such a beautiful lady in her youth, and you know, if people watch Dracula now or any of the films she made in the early 30s, I think she always really makes an impression because she has that kind of, you know, otherworldly aura that some of the actresses stylistically had back in those days. You know, there was just something about them that you know, sort of like archangel quality that some of them had, and she certainly had it, and she was. You know, and she was a great stage actress. She had, I mean, marvelous stuff on Broadway and so on and so forth. But she just, you know, it just was like some horrible cloud was over for most of her life, and it was very, very sad.
Well, Greg, it's pretty obvious that you and Gary and I absolutely love the movies, especially the classic movies, and all the better if they're the scary ones. Not only love, but I think all three of us could say that they are indeed our passion. Can you return next week? We're just about at the end of our episode tonight, but can you return next week so we can continue?
Yes, I'd be delighted. Thank you.
And I tell you, I'll give you a promise. We will start off with our own John Carradine story for you.
Oh, absolutely, because we do have one.
Great. I love Carradine stories, so that would be I will be looking forward to that.
Oh, very good.
So, well, until then, I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and this is just the beginning of an incredible story. Come back next week for part 2.